my hand on my heart, I probably would be sitting in the at least semi-con natural wine camp. So there we are.
Okay, that's great. What I'm going to start is with taking those, I've drafted them into the questions. Let's have a look where they are. So one of the first one was, do you recall the first time you tasted natural wine? And did you find any of those characteristics distinctive or appealing? Can you tell us about that experience, please?
That was a tricky first question for me, because the very first ostensibly natural wine I tasted was in Russia, in Moscow specifically, at a restaurant. And it was the wine from Georgia, the country, not the US state. Mm-hmm. And it was absolutely filthy. There was nothing good. The number of faults were more than the number of faults we've ever identified, although I probably could not have identified all the possible anisole taints.
Do you remember that wine? I mean, was it, which region, what color? Because I love Georgian wines, and the wine, but it was bitten this whole thing, the ambition or my passion started in Georgia, which is very interesting. And you hated the first natural wine from Georgia.
But to be fair, it was one imported into Moscow.
Okay, it's a market.
And I'm pretty sure it was a white wine, although it was deeper than amber, and not beautiful amber as one might find an ancient Sauternes, but iridescent orange.
Okay.
That was the first of the faults. It was cloudy, it had volatile acidity, etc., etc.
Okay, so that didn't really gave you a good impression. Sorry about that. Now we can move on to the second one. I mean, it says the question was, did you ever taste the wine? Of course, you taste wines. I think it's a natural wine. And how was it that difference was to the rest of the natural wines? What do you think of that?
Well, yes. The answer is yes. There have been some very good ones. Not sure how many, but one that I absolutely love was a theoretically orange Bacchus produced for litmus wines in England by a top-class winemaker, John Warrenchak, whom I have so much time for. He almost never makes a faulty wine, and one of his Pinot Noirs tasted, from England even, tasted deliciously. I'm going to say 80, oh, crikey. Certainly at least 12 to 15 years later. And it almost tasted like a top-class Burgundy. It was stunning. Okay, it was from a great vintage. But apart from that, he makes very good wines, and they never have faults.
Okay, well, so
in my experience.
That litmus is not that old. It's newish, isn't it? That litmus wine.
But he has been a winemaker both in the UK and even in places like the Ukraine, throughout most of Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed originally in Australia. So he's got tons of experience and is definitely younger than I am.
So the reason why I think you liked that wine, you appreciate it, because it didn't have any faults. Okay, interesting.
No, but it also had character. Mm-hmm. And you could almost even taste a bit of that Bacchus, almost like a gentle Sauvignon Blanc in the wine itself.
I see. Yeah, I like that wine too. I've tasted. I'm a fan of English sparkling wines, not the still one, not so much, but yeah, that was one of the outstanding wines, or the one that standed out from the crowd for me. Okay, we're going to move on to the questions. Patricia, thank you so much. Another one is, we know that you're not a great fan of natural wines for many reasons. We're going to discuss about them. But what are the three biggest reasons for your stance against natural wines?
I myself have a bit of a laugh when I saw this question, because my three reasons would be faults, faults, and more faults. But having said that, I do think that a lot of natural wine is unreliable. They often do not have much longevity.
Mm-hmm.
And, as a consumer, I am risk averse. I'm not saying I'll go down and buy, the cheapest, cleanest, straight off the conveyor belt wine, but I still am careful. And I must admit that for me, there are so many natural wines that are so natural as to be unnatural. I know it's terrible to say, but it's often poor winemaking with too little protection.
Mm-hmm.
So the wines are fragile and they do not last. As far as I'm concerned, you can keep your clouds and your Brett and your volatile acidity and your moussiness and all the other various faults that natural wines often demonstrate.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, another question before we move on to the keynotes that you kind of presented to me. I will share the screen in a minute. And thank you so much for the students. Most of the students in this lesson today are Diploma students. And they're working for their assignment, which is in July 2020. And one of the questions was, what do you think are the biggest challenges, both in the vineyard and the winery, for making natural wines?
Well, I mean, the list is endless, but I think some vignerons have not thought about the implications of less intervention or when intervention should take place. When do you use agrochemicals, or when do you not use to have them in the vineyard? You have to apply them carefully, which requires training and understanding to avoid underspraying or overspraying. In other words, not too little and not too much. I think fertilizers of whatever, including manure and whatever else happens to be coming in, have to be carefully applied. Do you till the soil? And it depends on your soil composition and depends on your climate and indeed weather conditions. Winter pruning, how much, how little. Summer pruning, how do you, and canopy management. Yield control, I think in general is crucial, but I think for natural wines is very important.
Mm-hmm.
So really it's in the vineyard, it's what to do, when and how. And in the winery, well, you have to start with selection. If you are trying to use low intervention, you must try to avoid grapes with diseases, botrytis, but underripe and overripe, depending on the style of wine that you want. And then you have to consider, once you've selected which grapes you're using or bunches you're using, what are you going to add, if anything? I mean, natural wine doesn't have an absolute definition yet, but are you going to add diammonium phosphate because your grapes don't have enough nitrogen, which may cause sluggish fermentations during alcohol fermentation? Do you use natural yeasts? Maybe, if you've got them and if they're the good ones as opposed to the bad ones.
Yeah.
Or do you get yeast from l'allemande, or whomever, and mix them together to start your AF, even if other yeast might take control. Would you use enzymes to precipitate things like lactase or glucanase if your grapes are not perfect? Do you add SO2 pre-fermentation or not? That's always a big question, but that's true for most conventional growers and producers as well. And then beyond that, how do you undertake, which is relevant to what I've just said, how do you undertake minimal intervention without spoiling the wine? How fast do you ferment? You know, what's the temperature going to do? Do you cool it? Do you not cool it? Do you stick it in a garage with the barn doors open at night, which is the Burgundian tradition? When do you rack off? Do you rack off a little before it's completed its alcoholic fermentation? Or do you leave it until it's less than 2 grams per liter of residual sugar, which is technically dry? And of course, much further on, do you filter? And if so, how far down do you, oh, I saw a look there. And if you do, how far down do you filter? I mean, you could even filter your must, but you know, unless you're really trying to do squeaky clean, you might not. But how far down do you go to obliterate yeasts, to obliterate bacteria? What about fining? Whoa, there's a big question. Big, very important. And if you do, with what? And to do what? And in regard to fining, I have to say, fining trials are absolutely critical. You must figure out how much is the right amount, not too much, because you don't really want to leave any in.
Yeah.
And in theory, if you find it the correct amount, you don't leave any in. Okay, well then, what about bottling? Whoa, measuring dissolved oxygen? Do you top up with carbon dioxide or a blend of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide? Or, you know, are you into the expensive argon? Only if you are very wealthy. And what about closures? And how does that change what you would do as you are putting your wine or getting very close to putting your wine into the bottle? Do you have more dissolved oxygen? Do you have less dissolved oxygen? And with minimum SO2, you might consider how close to 0 dissolved oxygen can I go? And if you have no sulfur dioxide or no free sulfur dioxide or no added sulfur dioxide, how are you going to ship with the ultimate in protection? Because that is difficult to control. And for the importer distributor, how do you store it? Once, even if it comes in, you know, completely refrigerated containers, where is it going after that? Is it simply going into a 10-degree cellar? And if so, can you guarantee that? Question mark. And of course, for the consumer, or indeed for the retailer, how do you store it once you've taken delivery from your importer or distributor? So the real question is, where does intervention start and where does it stop? Believe me, I still say there are pitfalls all along the way, whether you are conventional, natural, or almost anything in between.
Wow, thank you so much. There was a lot of technical stuff there. So while we're on that, I think I would love to share the screen, and then you can talk through to us about, you know, from those points if you like. Now, I'm sharing this one. So there you go. These are for you to, your presentation basically, Patricia, and I will just move on when you're ready.
Yep, I'm happy to share. I think that it really was from the late 1960s in France, mostly Beaujolais and Loire. But in more recent decades, late 70s, 80s, young people in Parisian wine bars, and indeed, especially in Japan, kind of took a view that they wanted natural wines. Now, part of it was either a perception or perhaps from the producers, an idea that they were more natural, less interventionist than conventional. There are certainly links to biodynamic production and organic production.
Yes.
And I think the main thing, you all will all need to come up with your own definition of what is a natural wine. But in principle, they are attempts to make wine without added sulfur dioxide or with minimal levels of added sulfur dioxide. I'll just put a little caveat to that because most yeast during alcoholic fermentation will produce some natural sulfur dioxide.
Can I ask you that?
Sorry, even with no added, there will be some.
Sorry, Patricia, what is the, there's no definition we know for natural wines, but is there any limit, is it 90 milligram per liter or is it 100? What is that for the SO2, total SO2 in a bottle of natural wine?
Well, there is no level because there is no definition legally apart from the very recent Vin Méthode Nature syndicat in France. That is the only legal, or at least syndicat joinable group who do not permit addition above 30 milligrams per liter. But apart from that, anything even marketed as a natural wine can be as much as any wine that is legal to sell in the EU or in the country in which it is made or in the country in which it is sold. Mm-hmm. So in principle, they could have as much sulfur dioxide as any of our standard wines, as if you like. And I think it's apart from people who might join this syndicat in France, I think that it's impossible to say that they will be absolutely less than conventional winemaking. Nowadays, most dry reds are below 100 milligrams per liter total sulfur dioxide, unless they've been really poorly made. And indeed, even white wines, unless they have been shipped in bulk and bottled in the country of sale, will also probably be well below the absolute maximum. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find very many that weren't affected by fungal disease to be much above 120 milligrams per liter of total sulfur dioxide. Okay, yeah, in principle, and this is sort of what most people that espouse natural winemaking do say, is they want to avoid chaptalization, they want to avoid additives, they want to use natural yeasts, even if they're in their winery, not necessarily on the grape skins. And they try to avoid clarification, i.e. they try to avoid filtration, fining, or indeed, believe it or not, even trying to precipitate tartrates.
Yeah, there was something that I really wanted to ask in your previous, before we start this presentation, in that technical one. I don't want to ask lots of questions from right now because there are lots of questions that the students submitted, which is great. I want to go to that. But the natural yeast, when I put the second screen, sorry, I can't do it now. There we go. It was about the oops, where am I going?
That's the beginning.
This is the, was I the, oh, because,
Okay, you started in the third slide, but
did
don't
I?
worry about it.
Oh, sorry, yeah, because I think it's a different format. Okay, this was the beginning. Sorry, I missed that. No, about the natural, okay, so I've started with the third, was it?
Yep. No, you started with the one beyond that. So stop there once you get it up.
Oh, okay. So no, it was about the natural yeast. I want to ask you quickly there. All these producers that I've seen at the beginning of my career by Sonvino, I was importing those wines. When I asked this question, I never get a clear answer from them. When you have a natural yeast and you have stuck fermentation, what do you do? What do they? What do they?
You get some yeast from l'Allemand, and you make up a culture and you put it in, or you take a ferment that's going strongly and you develop that culture, if you like, from one that is going strongly, and you then chuck it in at massive quantities into a vat that has stuck or is sluggish.
So they do it.
And I mean massive, like 5 times as much as normal.
So they use unnatural yeast in that case. Okay,
No,
so would you like me to go back to this slide?
It came from one of your own vats.
Yeah.
And that's possible. I've done it myself.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. I'll go back to those first slides in that case, yeah?
Well, I think we probably answered the first question. Yeah. What does natural mean?
Okay.
And I think it's unfair to say that it is an absolute term, because it does not have an absolute definition. Therefore, it's a little bit amorphous or relative rather than absolute. And I'm afraid to say, those of you who are sitting your diploma, you have got to develop your definition, or a definition that you believe is correct, and it should go in your introduction, because that definition is what your paper will be marked in accordance with.
Yes.
So I've listed some of the ways that you might consider defining it for yourself. Organic, biodynamic. What about sustainable? In other words, you try not to use more agrochemicals than you need to, but if you do, you will. There is a view that it does require minimal intervention, and I think sustainable kind of fits into that. And typically for most natural wines, they would rather do physical intervention rather than chemical. And by that, I guess I mean they prefer not to add other things. So no additives or few additives. So no chaptalization and other things we've mentioned. And believe it or not, little, or in my opinion, questionably, no sulfur dioxide. Personally, I am not a fan of no sulfur dioxide, but you can take or choose if you prefer.
Okay, definition is important, guys. All right. So next slide was terroir.
Well, I mean, we just need to have a little review about terroir. And this is a very broad-brushed view of terroir, but I think it pretty much covers almost everything that even a Frenchman or others on the continent would agree. Climate and mesoclimate, certainly subsoils and topsoils, and topography, altitude, the geography of your vineyard. But I think in France, certainly, and more frequently nowadays, the human influences that influence your terroir are things like planting density, how you prune, what your yields are, And of course, everything we've already discussed about winemaking and aging and bottling and fining filtration, of course, they will affect the expression of terroir.
Okay. And we've discussed about this already, and this we haven't.
No, I think this is possibly where I come down on the debate side of not convinced, because the minimal sulfur dioxide and non-interventionist approach can lead to instability in the wine and spoilage before it ends up in my glass. You get rogue yeast with natural yeast because you'll get some of these Picolata bizarra, or whatever you want to call them, but believe me, I have a list of 15 that are mixed in with the good ones, if they're indigenous yeasts. And of course, the unwanted bacteria, either on the grapes, or even if you are pretty good about cleaning your winery, they can hang about. Or, you know, those funny little bugs that kind of fly in and land on the cap of red wine, bringing acetic bacteria. Okay. Hence the reason that if you are really going with the minimal SO2, and even more if you're going with the no SO2 regime, it requires intensive temperature control during all the stages of winemaking. And, you know, you can't have open cap fermentations because you don't want those funny little fruit flies from your next door neighbor's peaches finding their way onto the cap, bringing in Acetobacter. So temperature control, both during maturation, shipment, storage, which I've mentioned why, because a small rise in ambient temperature, even in a closed container, means a tenfold rise in the rate of reproduction of all those baddies that I've mentioned, whether they're rogue yeast, unwanted bacteria, you know, leftover things you didn't filter or fine away, and they just keep growing. So it's a tricky production process.
Yes. What have we got here?
This is me definitely on the side. So, I mean, my quote that I use so regularly, Serhat is so tired of hearing this. He doesn't want me to say it, but I will.
Please.
Often they are so natural as to be unnatural. And for me, unnatural means poor quality. Some of you may know that there's this absolutely top quality wine bar bistro in central London, very close to the National Gallery and St. Martin in the Fields and Charing Cross Road, called Terroir.
Yes.
And I go there a lot. It's pre-theatre dining. Well, it has been until lockdown, but before that. And our son goes there, our daughter goes there, everybody goes there. But I have to say that in the early days of my going there, I think I must have sent back more than 50% of the bottles that we ordered, my husband and I, as faulty.
Le Cave de Crenne is owned by Le Cave de Crenne.
I know. Well, nowadays, the guys are really kind to me. They're used to my sending things back as full bottles. So they will give me a wine they think I will like in a tiny little cup so that we can taste it fast. And if we like it, then they will sell us a bottle. Why did I think they were faulty? Well, okay, oxidation, excessive Brettanomyces, excessive volatile acidity, musty, mousy, sometimes even that thick, gluey stuff that goes down a glass. Or they were cloudy and had too much grit. Now, don't get me wrong, with a 40-year-old Sauterne, I'm okay with grit at the bottom of the glass. And I might even chew the grit because the wine was so good, I didn't want to leave one drop. But if I'm buying a wine that's a couple of years old, I do not want cloudy or gritty.
Okay.
So those are just some of the faults.
I know. And my anecdote with terroir is until I realized that it was actually owned by a competition. You know, another importer, because I was doing those days, I was importing only natural wines and trying to get lists in restaurants that specialize in natural wines. And terroir was one of my targets. And I went there tastings. I was showing my wines, and they were just Alessandro and the other French guy, I forgot his name, tasting my wines, and they never got back because they just want to know who else is, you know, selling natural wines, and they were never interested in buying my wines. Okay, Patricia, thank you so much I will come out from this, and then we can continue our question and answer session. Okay, 5. I think I just want to have a look. There is somebody trying to get in still. I will accept this person who's a bit late, but Bruno, waiting room. Sorry about that. Now, once again, we continue on the questions. Again, guys, you have submitted amazing questions. We're not going to do all of them. Some of them are anyway overlapping. So the first question is so I've grouped them to Viti and Vini and Market. As the assignment is, I think the majority part is, you know, their focus should be on the market, how this product, you know, debate from both sides of the stories. Therefore, there were a lot of questions from the market point of view. But first, before we come to the market, the Viti, I would like to ask about that number 6 question. Will countries or regions with strong disease pressure ever be able to fully subscribe to the natural viticulture and wine scene?
Well, I'll tell you what I think about that. It really does depend on the producer. And I have to say, some producers, even in the most difficult climates, can actually produce. For instance, Jamie Milton at Milton Vineyards in Gisborne has to be one of the wettest parts of the entire world. I mean, it almost makes England look like it's dry, which we know is not true. But he produces biodynamically. He's incredibly careful, he and his wife Annie and now children, spend so much time in their vineyard, but they are biodynamic. And I have to say, if they can do it, of course it's possible. Okay, yields will be lower, and some producers, depending on the cost of your land, the cost of your labor, the cost of whatever you're doing, they may not be economically viable. But I would say that they are possible.
Okay, great. So moving on from the cost, another question was about the cost. Relating to costs of organic and biodynamic certification, does it depend on the size of the vineyard or the grapes? Are there higher risk grapes or regions? That was number 9.
Yeah, well, different certification bodies, for instance, Demeter, based in Germany, but is covered globally. And in fact, I think Milton in New Zealand may be registered with Demeter. I wouldn't swear to that, but they may be. Or Biodivin in France. They have different requirements for whether it's grape or whether it's number of bottles or, you know, number of hectoliters produced. But it does depend on which organization, and each one of those might have slightly different requirements. Like I discovered that if you want to be biodynamic under Biodivin in France, you cannot have your grapes grown under a power line.
Wow.
Which I did not know. So, you know, even those of us who think we know everything do not. You could be organic, but you can't be biodynamic under a power line. So there's a lovely little snippet. And it does depend on which organization one chooses to belong to, if one chooses to belong at all. Now, there are many producers who are almost organic or in good years would be organic, but they don't want to pay the fees. And to be honest, they would like the option in a year where there is disease pressure or weed pressure to be able to use chemicals, agrochemicals, you know, the likes of ICI or Honpoulon or whoever else is producing them this week. So, I mean, they're what I would call integrated vine management, which has, again, no legal definition, but it's a mindset. They use agrochemicals only when they need to, as opposed to, at least from 2 years ago, the theoretical recommendation in England is that you spray with a certain cocktail every 10 to 14 days, whether you need it or not. What careful producers are doing, whether they are natural, organic, biodynamic, or the other amorphous term sustainable, are doing is they actually keep an eye on their vines, they keep an eye on their soils, and they decide to only spray when they need it, either, or in the weather, in fact. You know, welcome to the world of the non-meteorologist, but, you know, sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong. But, you know, if you keep an eye on your vineyard, if you're careful, you don't have to spray every 10 to 14 days with whatever the cocktail is. You don't need Roundup to kill off your weeds. Well, I think that may be almost illegal now anyway. But the point is, if you're careful, you don't have to have a tight regime of agrochemicals. And shockingly, that will save you money because agrochemicals are not cheap.
Okay, great. So that takes me to the next question, which is very linked to the one we just had. So what happens, you know, if, you know, like in Chablis 2016, you know, what happened to that? If they lost their certification, do we know the answer? You know, if they were part of that and they had to spray, and they did, so what happens? Do they have to wait another 3 years? Do you know?
I don't absolutely know, but those are producers that I would have grouped under what I call integrated vine management, stroke integrated pest management. They may have decided during the good years that they could convert to organic, and then they joined and became certified organic. But normally, any of the organizations that certify as organic require a 3-year conversion period with no agrochemicals added. And even longer for most biodynamic certifying organizations. It's usually 5, and one or two of the minor ones have 6 years with no agrochemicals. What I personally do not know, but it might be worth investigation by all of you.
Exactly.
I didn't have the time. Is whether once you've sprayed, do you go back to year 0 and need 3 more years before you get recertified? And I do not know the answer. So you see, I'm not perfect. I do not always know the answers.
Okay.
If I were the certifying organization, I might try and test using some obscure, well, not that obscure, but maybe using petiole analysis.
Okay.
And soil analysis to see whether there were residues from the previous year's agrochemical applications. But I don't know if they're that sophisticated.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think I'm going to move now to the Vinny group questions. So we can, you know, go through that a little bit for, you know, 1 or 2 or 3, whatever, from the Vinny and then the market ones. Now, number 13 was, there is certainly a certain percentage of natural wines that are poorly made and have obvious faults. However, do you believe there are some natural wines that can and are being made in a way that is not faulty and taste more like conventional wines? And then it continues, can natural wines ever be delicious?
I think the answer to the second part is there is no reason why so-called natural wines cannot be delicious. And in fact, some are. Although I have to put a caveat on that. in that at the moment, there are no wines I personally know of that are recognized as among the absolute top wines, best wines, whoever rates them, that are trying to flog themselves as natural wines. But I personally have a lot of time for the Brett brothers in Burgundy, who are biodynamie, and Benziger in Sonoma, who are biodynamie, and Jamie Milton, as I've mentioned already. They are very good wines, and in most tastings where I judge, I would be giving them golds when the wines are at that standard, and they usually are. So yes, they do usually use less sulfur dioxide, but they hardly ever use no sulfur dioxide. And most will be less than 100 milligrams per liter of total SO2. Back to the original question, I think, yes, it's absolutely true that there are a lot that are poorly made. And that is because of what I said before. It requires that much more attention to detail and a lot more care. And I guess the best ones that I get, I suppose I would classify as natural, tend to be organic or biodynamic. But that's because the producers spend a heck of a lot more time in the vineyards and in the cellars, and they know what they need to do and when they need to do it. And they do it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for that. Now, something that I did a class, a workshop, in fact, last week on Friday. It was about my approach, how I would do. A lot of students today were part of that, and there was this question that I didn't know, and I would like to ask you that. Is mousiness widely considered as a serious fault? And can you tell, if you know about details about a little bit of that, what is mousiness? Mousy?
Well, actually, it's a bacterial infection.
Okay.
And it kind of smells like mouse droppings. If you've ever had an infestation in your house,
I did once.
You might know what they smell like. Decomposed mouse droppings. But also, it can lead to gloopiness. In other words, the wines become ropey. They dribble in an excessively glutinous form. Wow. Down the side of a bottle or down the side of a glass, and they are foul. Believe me, that's something you would not put in your mouth. It's right up there with high level of TCA or TBA or any of those other aerosols.
But I guess that's not a particular thing to, it could happen in any wine. I mean, I've never had a natural wine which had, mousiness, but it could, yeah.
I don't think it's particular to natural wines, organic wines, biodynamic wines, or conventional wines. It's carelessness.
Oh, great. Now, another question from Vinny, the last one, before we move on to the market ones. There's, I think there's 10 of them I would like to go through. What are the key disciplines or do's and don'ts to make no less intervention with vinification successful from the producer's point of view?
Well, you saw my answer.
Yeah.
The very first thing is healthy grapes. You cannot have disease on your grapes. So selection, selection, and selection. Then processing up to and including fermentation. Quick, cool, gentle. Get them in the winery, make sure it's clean, keep it cool, and don't over extract. Okay? Protect from oxygen, always. I mean, it sounds really stupid, and most of you, if any of you were in any of my WSET lectures whenever, you'll know my KISS theorem. Keep it simple, stupid, but keep your hands on. And believe me, I fell into that trap once. One of my early non-interventionist problems was that we were only processing grapes from Monday to Saturday. And we'd finished up at about, I don't know, 6:30 on a Saturday evening. And my being both stupid and lazy did not clean the press, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because I did not clean the press, guess what I found when I turned up on Monday morning at 6:15? The amount of mold was well beyond. Yeah, believe you me, it makes mold on your local yogurt, cheese, whatever, look like it's simple to get rid of. I learned my lesson the hard way. So you always have to clean up before you leave, but you also need to run it again. Clean your equipment before you start again the following day, the following 2 days, whenever. It really is important. And I mean, I still believe, and I always will believe, in the judicious use of sulfur dioxide, which is the universal additive for protecting against oxidation, for protecting the quality of your grapes. But that doesn't mean you have to chuck in 100 milligrams per liter of sulfur dioxide every time. You know, you need to figure out how much you think is needed. Yeah, if it's 30 degrees outside, you might need a bit more. But if it's 15 degrees, you could get away with less. And if you're down at 12 degrees or 10 degrees, like we often are when we harvest in England or Burgundy, then you can use less. And so I think, and you know, if you're processing quickly from press to alcoholic fermentation, and it's going to kick off either in very cool conditions or quickly, you can probably get away without adding any pre-alcohol fermentation. But then you need to keep an eye on it, and you might need to add some after alcoholic fermentation. And in fact, I know Serhat probably, or all of you, have looked at the France, the vin méthode nature in France, and they say you may not add before AF. Well, quick, cool, and gentle is even more important then. Okay, rant over.
Okay, great. Now, market questions, which are great questions. Well done, everybody, for submitting these questions. Now, the first one is about the category. You know, the challenges. There's these about the French products. So, is there a special category for natural wines and wine judging? Can and are these wines being tasted and evaluated in a similar manner than non-natural wines? Conventional wines, let's say.
Yeah, basically, no. I would say the answer is no. Every now and then you have a category that might be what we would call slightly obscure, and occasionally you'll get one for biodynamie or organic. In fact, drinks business, which I judge for regularly, does have a master section for only organic stroke biodynamic wines. And that's the only thing that can be put in. And those are the only ones tasted. Mm-hmm. But if we're, for example, tasting rosé, there might be some that are so-called natural. There might be some that are conventional. There might be some that are organic. There might be some that are biodynamic. And we just taste them. Mm-hmm. If a wine is good, then it's good. But they are judged as wine, not as natural wines, apart from, as I mentioned, organic wines. Having said that, the Thames and Chiltern Vineyards Association, of which I'm the vice chairman and technical director, whatever that means, we have a separate trophy for unchaptalized wines, which, as you might imagine, in London, Oxfordshire, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, and a few fringe areas like bits of Hertfordshire, it's a real challenge not to chaptalize. But most years we get 3 or 4 samples out of 40 wines that are unchaptalized. And we, every year, at least for the last I'm going to go with 10, possibly even longer years, we have been able to award an unchaptalized wine the trophy, which means that even though we didn't at the time necessarily know that it was unchaptalized, we gave it at least a silver medal.
Okay, so I do judge a lot in lots of UK and international competitions, and so far I've not seen that category yet. Okay, moving on, another one, number 23, the market question. Is there potential for, this is about the labels basically, in an addition of nutritional information in the wine labels, or at least on wine producers' websites? What do you think?
Well, I think there are options for that. And, that's what back labels are often about. For those of you who know the producer, Ridge Vineyards in California gives you so much information on the back label. I mean, Paul Draper is a brilliant man.
I've been there.
But they give you so much that even I occasionally glaze over. Well, maybe not, but nearly. Or, in the old days, Dick Arrowwood, with some of his wines, would put tons of information on the back label. And there are people who will label their wines unfined and unfiltered, which is not a legal requirement, but is useful information. And of course, producers who are keen to feed into the vegetarian or vegan market will always label their wines vegan friendly or vegetarian friendly, because they are specifically targeting their wines for those markets. And I don't put them down for that. I'm happy to have vegan or vegetarian wines. I mean, I had vegetarian dinner last night. So, that shows you where I go. In general, though, I think that the only way to find out exactly what happened, is to get onto the producer's website and ask for their technical fiche technique, or, technical spec, because they have to have that in order to export anywhere. And in fact, legally, under HACCP, they have to keep it in their winery. So even if it isn't on their website, they could find it if someone wanted it. We don't normally, and I don't think we would, require people ever to list things that you don't have to. So the things that are normally listed are the things that are legally required. So yes, contain sulfites. And frankly, even if you had no added sulfites, that probably has to go on your label, because there are some that are produced through alcoholic fermentation or MLF if you undertake that. So I think that would still have to be on your label, even if nothing else is. And one thing I found really interesting, and it's sort of related, but not necessarily, is that there is an Austrian producer of sparkling wines. Most of you, or many of you, will have heard of them, Schlumberger, to use the German pronunciation, based in Vienna, but most of their grapes come from Lower Austria, Niederösterreich, so north of Vienna. Mm-hmm. They claim to have lower levels of histamines in their wines, which I think is probably true, because you could test for histamines in a wine. That you can do in a lab. I might even be able to do it in my kitchen counter. Maybe. I think I might have the equipment. Not sure, but might. But the point is, that is a valid claim. And they claim, and possibly true, that they give you less of a chance of a hangover. And slightly related to that, because they only produce sparkling wines, as far as I know, although they may be branching out to one or two still wines. But certainly, historically, it's been all sparkling. But I think it's a valid claim, because the base wines for sparkling wine have to be absolutely pristine, really clean, before they go through their second fermentation. I mean, how many of us have ever had a hangover from champagne? Well,
I love that, this is,
probably depends on how much you drink. But the
yeah,
point is, champagne and other base wines for sparkling wines are really crystal clear. Okay, yes, they then get the second fermentation in, but most of that comes out because it clogs up the top of the closure before you pop it off, freeze it and pop it off. And the reason you have to be so clear with that is that if you've got excessive deposits or tartrates or any of that stuff, then you get excessive frothing. And, the cork will come out before you even take the muzzle off,
yeah,
the windy thing that holds the cork in.
yeah.
And my favorite story about this, and this is anecdotal, but absolutely true.
Hello?
We had Jancis Robinson come to open it. And in the middle of Jancis's talk, bless her, one of the bottles, fizz, sitting in a rack on the side, popped open, broke 5 other bottles at the same time. Now, okay, I wasn't party to making that wine. I do know who were, some of my students even. But it just shows you that if your base wine isn't really clear before you start your second fermentation, stuff happens. Hence the reason sparkling wine bottles are heavier and need to be to withstand 5.5 atmospheres of pressure. Okay, enough stories.
Okay, Patricia, no, that's great. I do have to say that we're going to run over a little bit time, guys, everyone. I know we said it's going to be 45 minutes, but we were already above that. It's like almost an hour now. I'm happy to continue, Patricia, if you are, another 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but I'm going to take less questions. Now, the other question is number 25, is with wine already being an intimidating subject to many consumers, natural wine requiring even more guidance and understanding. Do you think this will remain a niche product in the niche market?
I think so, because it really is one that needs hand selling and explanation, and it almost depends on the particular product that you're selling. It doesn't have a real definition, and consequently, it is a hand sell.
Yeah.
Maybe the French guidance will help.
Yes, the one that came out. Okay, great. Now the other one is about the orange wine. Do you think this is a merited trend, or do you think this the popularity might likely fade in the future, or will it become stronger in the next to the reds and whites? Orange wine.
Well, I think it's an oddity. But as most of us know, plenty of winemakers globally love experimentation. And so I think, some of them are actually quite good. I mean, apart from the Litmus Bacchus that I mentioned, there's also a chap down in La Mancha who makes a white using the orange method, i.e. fermentation with the skins and the pips from white grapes. So I think, yeah, it's different, but I'm sure it has its place and they can be good.
Okay, so from the consumer point of view, 2 questions. The first one is, why are so many consumers so unaware of what natural wines are? That's the first one, please.
Well, we've sort of answered that because there is no definition.
Okay, and fine. And then the other one is why have sales not rocketed for natural wines? We know that the millennials are really health conscious, but why has that not happened, do you think?
Well, in my opinion, it's partly because there is almost nothing more, or indeed less, helpful about so-called natural wines. Most contain some sulfur dioxide, and it's often the same level as well-made conventional wines. Okay, less than 100 milligrams per liter of total sulfur dioxide, but there's no legal requirement that it has to be unless they subscribe to the French Vin Méthode Nature organization. So I think, and the least helpful thing about wine is alcohol anyway.
I feel like opening a natural wine and drinking now. Okay. I
did think about putting some orange food coloring in a glass of white wine and decided that was wrong.
Great. Okay. Another question about the market. Why isn't more marketing or advertising going in to promote the natural wines?
Well, it goes back to what's to promote. I mean, there is no definition. Consequently, apart from Isabelle Legeron's raw wines fair in London, and I think is moving overseas or will move overseas once we're through this.
Berlin, Quebec, New York, Los Angeles.
Yeah, but it's very hard to market something that you can't define.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in a way it's a bit of a gimmick. I think it might be a bit of a marketing exercise designed to seduce the unaware. Promoting it as more healthful is a lie, but then so is most advertising, as we know. So I don't know, and I think that's why. But also, there isn't a single message that you can put out that everyone believes.
Okay, great. Now, another one, the traditional consumers, are they too picky about the perceived wine faults?
Well, if a fault is detectable, then it's a fault. As far as I'm concerned, trichloroanisole, bi-anisole, anyway, cork taint, as we loosely define it, is always a fault, wherever it comes from. Cork, barrel, winery, wherever. It's always a fault, even at a very low level.
Yeah.
For me, a low level of Brett or VA might be acceptable in some styles, but when I did my sensory evaluation modules at UC Davis, any detectable Brett or VA was too much. Now, I don't agree with that. I mean, otherwise I'd never drink Chateau de Beaucastel or most claret. So I don't, and oxidation, I have to say, unless it's on purposeful, like Oloroso sherry or Madeira, is usually a fault, but perhaps a slight oxidation character in aged wine is okay. And it depends a little bit on, so I think apart from the cork taint issue, I think there's a point at which it's too much, but it's a perception of how much is too much. So UC Davis, I got your diploma, but I don't agree with that.
Okay, great.
And I do think in young wines, most of those are faults because you want fruit and maybe oak.
Okay, so I'm going to take two more questions very quickly. How do you see the natural wine market developing over the next 10 years, and what challenges do you think it will face?
I don't necessarily think it expanding unless there becomes more of a move towards the van méthode naturelle, nature, like in France, because it's too amorphous. And yeah, a lot of the wines are a little too faulty, despite what I said earlier. I think some of the messages that are going out are misleading. I think it's niche, and it probably will stay niche. I mean, it's a bit like organic and biodynamic. I mean, they are niche. And so I think natural wine is another niche product.
Yeah, I mean, I started my business in 2015 as natural wine importer, and I think I'm still continuing importing wines. It's been 5 years, and I have moved from natural wine, just purely on natural wines. Now I do sell or import wines which are good, made sustainable, organic, biodynamic, natural, whatever. It doesn't matter. If it's a good product that I can sell and bring to the UK, with good value, then it's a good wine. But since then, I don't see it's grown or it's growing. But it's not going down either. I think it's kind of stable. That's my observation. Anyway, and the final question.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, the final question is, do you believe the Parkerization of wine influence of Robert Parker, if people don't know, is a real thing? And if so, how do you think that has influenced winemaking, for better or worse, in the past few decades?
Well, the answer to the first part of the question is yes, it is real, and was certainly centered on California initially, Pomerol with Michel Rolland and his outposts in South America and so on and so forth, but mostly for consumers who were into high fruit, high octane alcohol, high extract, and lots of oak. In other words, you know, a bit moreish. I think that trend has, I wouldn't say disintegrated, but I think it's largely gone back to where we were. I think it was a trend and everybody tried to jump onto it because Parker became so important after he really pegged the 1982 Bordeaux's. And he did indeed peg them. And believe me, they still taste great, even in 2020 and probably beyond. So I think there was a real, that was something people jumped on it because if they got a great rating from Parker or the Wine Spectator, you know, the Americans, then they were selling like immediately.
Yeah.
But I do think now a lot of the more delicate styles have come back and people really are looking for maybe concentration of flavor and maybe a bit less oak and maybe a bit less alcohol even. And certainly astute people like all of you are looking for that. We're not looking for, you know, blockbuster 15. Helen Turley can go away, even if she did go to school with me in my hometown.
All right, Patricia, that was amazing. Thank you so much for your time, presentation, and your, you know, your open and honest answers to all of these questions. And we had 32 students to join us from Hawaii to San Francisco to, you know, London and UK, all over students from UK and Europe as well. And I think, I'm not sure if you had any from anyone Asia, from South Pacific or Australia. Because of the
Probably
time.
a funny time for them, actually.
Yeah, I think they're a bit in sleeping now mode. But this was great. Thank you so much. And everyone joining us today to watch. I have recorded the session and I think I will share that with you. Bye.
And you're also welcome to send my little presentation to everyone because there were some sources that they may need to look at for their papers.
Definitely, I will do that. Please send me an email, guys. Ladies and gentlemen, have a good evening. Thank you so much, Patricia. Bye-bye.
Cheers.